This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for Heart Mojo with Melinda Smith. And Melinda, you've been away
I
and
have.
enjoying warm weather and sunshine, and I'm very jealous.
Well, a little warm weather. It wasn't exactly warm, warm. I did take off the beginning of the month and I went to Florida, safely traveled. Those of you who follow me on Facebook saw my lovely picture on the airplane with the mask and the face shield. Though I have to tell you, having traveled my whole life, I really think that it's probably the safest time to be in the air than ever because I've never seen the airplane so clean, ever.
That's a
And
good thing.
it's amazing. I think if people are worried, it's more at their destination or the airport. But we were at the beach enjoying the water, which is so relaxing for me. It always has been. And given everything that's gone on in life, I really, really needed it. So even if it was a little cold, though us crazy Ohioans were in the pool anyway, it was 82 degrees. And everybody looked at us like, what the heck are they doing? But then you just jump in the hot tub. So, yeah, so I enjoyed my time away. But I have a very special guest that I met via LinkedIn. Kind of crazy how it puts people together. And her name is Kim Langley. Is that how you say it? Did I say it right? Okay.
Yes,
Kim,
yes.
welcome.
I'm
Tell
glad
us a
to
little
be
bit
here.
about you.
I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you.
Um, well, a quick précis would be that I've spent all of my career in education. I started out 1,000 years ago as a high school teacher. Can you imagine? And I discovered the older they were, the better I liked them because I taught juniors and seniors. And so I moved into adult learning, and I love adult learning. So I have made my career as speaker and trainer and the occasional giver of retreats, both business retreats and spiritually open retreats.
Mhm.
And then a few, well, let's see, almost 6 years ago now, uh, I went to a conference and it was wonderful. And while I was there, I was telling people that my avocation is leading discussion groups, and we use poems as a springboard for those discussions. You know, I pick a theme like endurance. That was one of the ones we did after the pandemic started.
Mhm.
And maybe there'll be 8 poems, and then we all get together or Zoom and we read them mindfully. There's a method for mindful reading, and then we use them as a springboard for conversation. And people love it in the way they love their book groups, you know, because it's not superficial conversation and it's open and accepting and it's always thought provoking, you know. So I'm telling the
Mhm.
group this at the conference lunch table, and the woman next to me leans over and goes, "So, do you have any poems on grief?" I'm like, "Do I have any poems on grief?" And it turns out that they have quite a few publications aimed at hospice workers and funeral directors and individual grievers, chaplains, and so on. And she said, "Why don't you send us a proposal?" And I was scared to death. I hadn't written a book. I wrote one about 30 years ago, but you know, so it took me 4 years. So it was a 4 year labor of love. The first year spent vetting about 1,000 poems to get ones that were really hit the mark. You know, they were accessible. I am very impatient with poems that make you feel stupid. You know, there are,
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, for some people, they love it. Okay. You know, we're all different. Art is very personal. I accept that. But if you want to use a poem as a springboard for conversation, people have to be able to wrap their minds around it. So it's the challenge and the fun was finding poems that are not da-dum 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 da-dum, or that look like they should be on the front of a greeting card, you know,
Mhm.
inspirational,
Right.
but that really speak honestly about the many facets of grief that people encounter depending on the situation. So that's not
That's
in
how
a
you got to
nutshell.
your book.
It is.
But before we dive into the book, because it's really
Yes,
super important. So these conference type things, and you mentioned endurance and getting through COVID, and have you been
yes,
able to move that into the Zoom and the online
I
uh,
have.
groups, or what have you done?
Oh, well, So of course, most of them, I was doing webinars already before the pandemic because, a lot of people have various locations in their businesses and they need to, sometimes it would be blended learning. Like I'd be in a classroom with people and then there'd be people having distance learning from other cities or even other countries, which was always kind of fun. So that helped, thank heavens, my material is adapted for, was adapted for Zoom. So I didn't have to make a lot of changes. And because I'm used to teaching in different kinds of environments, I mean, hopefully I wasn't too boring because the hard part.
I know we talked about that at great length.
Right?
You're like, I don't want to be boring when I'm out.
Right. And the hard part for people that are used to doing stand-up training, like some, not all, classroom teachers, is that you're there and you set up a dynamic with the group and your body is your audiovisual aid. And, when you're Zooming or webinaring, you don't have that. So I don't have as much work as I did before, to be honest, because, companies and organizations are just scrambling to figure out, how to do all this.
Mm-hmm.
But I did get an invitation soon after the pandemic hit us all in the head like a brick, to do something on, resilience in the face of change. And one of my topics is resilience. I do a lot of training on emotional intelligence and the science of happiness, the science of optimism, not motivational frou-frou, I hope,
Mm-hmm.
but, things that really give you skills that you can walk away with, and start using right away. So I do topics that are really engaging for me and others because they make your life better, but I try to do it in a way that's evidence-based and data-driven. So there still has been some work because people realize that their people need support.
Right.
And then of course, the other topics I do, like difficult conversations and dealing with difficult people, those are always in demand. And now it's almost worse sometimes because people are trying to have difficult conversations online. Like I had a call recently from people who work in the Ohio courts. I mean, imagine what it's like trying to do court work.
Yeah. Especially if you have to work with children or divorce or something like that.
Oh my
It's got to be
gosh,
awful.
yes. And people are working their tails off. I just give them so much credit. And I do train social workers and nurses for CEUs, because they always need continuing hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I love all my work. I love my corporate clients. I love my agencies that are trying to leave the world better than they found it, but I've
Mm-hmm.
been getting some really interesting assignments since the pandemic. Not as many, but very interesting. So,
Well, if you have to have less, at least make them interesting, right?
well, I was a full-time gardener for the first 3 months because everything just stopped, dead. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, like what's happening here? And then I thought, I haven't had this much time in the garden for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Make the most of it. So I did.
People worked in their yard, they worked in their house. You couldn't even find lumber because people
That's
were
what I
doing
heard.
decks and building.
Yeah.
And
I
so
mean,
it's amazing how we adjusted to
yes,
make
people
our home
nested.
environment more of the vacation spot.
Yes.
So,
And
well,
I mean, it's all about the simple pleasures right now, right?
right. Well,
Yeah.
and one of the things when we hooked up on LinkedIn, I saw your book called Send My Roots Rain. I bought it on Amazon. Admittedly, I've only skimmed its poetry some because I just got it. I haven't had a lot of time to read it. But it's about grief. And one of the things I read on the back, right, was there's no right way to grieve. And this book helps you to honor your own path. And that's what
Yes.
these poems do and give you reflection. So because it doesn't seem like it's a large book, but there's so much in it and so much about grief right now, different types of grief. You and I had a conversation about that,
Yes.
that we are going to divide my normal podcast into 2 podcasts to cover that information, to be able to help everybody maybe find a way to deal with whatever grief they are going through during this pandemic, because it isn't always about death and it isn't always about that type of loss.
Right.
So I'm going to let you divide this into 2 sections. And how would you like to start with that?
Well, I think I'd like to talk a little bit about what the book can do for people who are either actively grieving, because, you know, as of today, I think 419,000 deaths. I mean, it's just, you can't even wrap your mind around a number that big. And then all the people downstream from those losses, you know, their families and friends and colleagues, and then the people who are trying to minister to them, the healthcare people, the chaplains, the clergy, the funeral directors. So loss is touching a lot of lives now. And actually, let me say this. I had an opportunity to speak to a group of human resource directors not too long ago. And my message to them was, if you haven't updated your policy on bereavement for 20 years, now is the time to look at it, because most organizations, even benevolent, well-run organizations, it's typically 3 days, you know, and then you're supposed to be back at work. And that is completely flies in the face of the research. And I'm not saying we don't have to be tough when we're grieving. Toughness is one of the things called for when you're grieving, but too much toughness is bad for your physical and mental health. So people are struggling in part because, for one thing, their employers don't understand. Really, they're not very knowledgeable about grief. Well, who was? Our whole culture is still learning a lot about grief, and there's a lot of research that has happened only in the last 40 years, which, you know, over the history of humanity is the blink of an eye. So I wouldn't expect HR directors to be experts on grief, but I gave them so much credit for bringing me in to talk, because you know, actually it'd be good for their company. If you're good to somebody when they lose somebody, boy, you just have their appreciation for a long time. And if you are not good to somebody when they lose somebody, they will never forget it, you know? So let me say that very quickly.
Well, I'm glad that they were receptive and brought you, because that's big in the business world for them
It
to
is. And, you
want to
know,
do that.
one good thing, I don't mean to sound like I'm against business, because I work for so many, you know, wonderful clients that are really trying to have good and ethical companies. One good thing about businesses, and we need to like kind of have structures in place where we can invite our bereaved colleagues and employees into it, is a lot of them are offering yoga and mindfulness training and Tai Chi and so on. And part of my message was, first of all, it wouldn't even be inappropriate to have a mental health type grief group at the workplace that people could come to on their lunch period. That'd be great. But if you can't feel like you can't do that, then at the very least, have somebody call or walk over and talk to someone who's recently bereaved and say, you know, maybe not this week and maybe not next week, but, you know, Tai Chi is supposed to be really good for people that are carrying a heavy load. And we have a class here and so on. So
do you
anyway,
think
my book, I teach resilience. Can you tell? One of my topics for many years has been in introducing us average Joes and Josephines to this huge body of research on how to be resilient that a lot of us aren't at all familiar with, you know? And so I put a lot of that into the book. And it's not the idea that get over it or, you know, chin up buttercup. It's not that kind of a book. That doesn't help anybody. But it does have suggestions for how you can stay on your feet during a very hard time.
Do you think there's special need, particularly for the healthcare workers? Because I work in the senior care industry, and the losses just don't stop.
I know. And, you know, that's a kind of trauma. I mean, you've probably seen some of the articles on, even when the pandemic is, and I use air quotes, over, because we know we may be wearing masks for longer than any of us wants to, you know, the trauma, especially among healthcare workers, is absolutely going to need to be addressed. You can't just watch people die day after day after day and not have, you know, not have some assistance. That's one of the reasons I'm saying chaplains and clergy and social workers in healthcare, they're all working very hard, but it's not enough because it's too much. You know, it's an overwhelming amount of illness and death. And I hope as a nation, we're smart enough to put some structures in place to help ourselves, because that what doesn't get helped get trickles right down into the family and the community.
Plus the suicide and abuse rates that have
Exactly.
increased, and
I mean,
alcohol
let's not be
abuse and
naive.
physical
Right.
abuse. And
Right. Right. You're very knowledgeable about this, Melinda. It's good to talk to somebody who you don't have to explain it. It's like, yes.
well, and I think many of the people who are part of my Heart Mojo family and who watch the podcast know it's about getting through these challenges,
Right.
which is why I wanted you here to be able to talk
it's
about
totally my pleasure to be of service.
How this book can help.
Well, let me say a little bit. First of all, you don't have to have had a death in your family to be helped by the book. With 4 years, I mean, I was working full time during those 4 years. That's one reason it took me a long time to write it. But the other reason was you only write a book once, and once it's in print, you can't change it. So I was really, I mean, my prayer all the time was, please don't let me say anything stupid. Please don't let me like sound a wrong note. I studied and studied and studied. I interviewed about 40 to 50 people who either had suffered losses or were in chaplaincy, or I had some spiritual directors of all different denominations. I talked to some people who were seekers but not churched. I really wanted the book to speak to a wide audience. And so although I think it is spiritual because I wrote it, it's not religious, and that was deliberate. It's not full of theology. There's nothing in here to fight over. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Too often theology becomes a source of contention. And I think it's my job, especially since I've taught emotional intelligence all these years, to be really, really respectful of the many ways that people are going to come at a loss. So that was one big thing. And another big thing was, where does it hurt? Why write a book that doesn't directly address where does it hurt? So often the last question I would ask in an interview is, if there was one thing that you would say, Kim, you have to put this in the book, because if I had known this, or this really helped me, what would that be? And then I took copious notes, and I made kind of a greatest hits list of painful spots that if you knew more, or if you were more self-accepting, or if you were more resilient, or if you knew that you don't have to listen to what your sister said that really cut you to the quick because she's doing her grief work and you're doing yours. If you knew that, would have really helped. And so the whole first movement of the book, which is in 4 movements, is about anticipatory grief. And I would say just about everybody in the country is experiencing that now. But at the time, the people we had in mind were people that had life-threatening illnesses. Like even if they were in good space and were recovering and so on, once you've had, cancer, for example, my friends with cancer say, every once in a while in the middle of the night, you wake up and think, wonder what kind of cells are running around in my bloodstream right now. It's a thing.
Oh, I know that well.
I know you do. And then if you look at how our nation is aging, so rapidly, the baby boomers are moving into their 70s and in their 80s and 90s, and people are living longer. So there are many more people than there used to be who have anticipatory grief about a grandma, a mother, a father, an aunt. I spoke with people at workshops who are taking care of 3 elders at one time. One woman I talked to was in her 20s. She had young children, appropriate when you're in your 20s, right? She had a maiden aunt and a bachelor uncle and a mother, all 70, 80, 90s. And she's taking care of all of them. Can you imagine?
And her children.
And her children, exactly. So the millennials have quickly become the sandwich generation. And some baby boomers, like the younger edge of the baby boomers, are sometimes taking care of somebody still, they're 70 years old. They're still taking care of a 95-year-old mother. Mm-hmm. So there are huge amounts of anticipatory grief. And some of it's completely altruistic, like I love my mother or dad, I want to take care of them. And some of it is the really painful stuff that you say to yourself, is this normal? Should I even be allowed to think this? Like, I'm 70. When does my life start? Like, when do I get to take a cruise? Well, yes, that is normal. Those are normal feelings. And if there's resentment mixed up with love and care, that's not unusual, but nobody talks about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to talk a little bit about that also. Also, I hope I'm not rattling on here.
Nope,
Oh, you're
it's
fine.
great.
Okay. You can tell I have so much passion for this subject. Another thing is that something about the American character, and I mean, I'm very grateful to live here and very conscious of all the privileges I have, and becoming more conscious all the time of privileges I didn't even know I had. So that's a good thing. But my point is that in some cultures, people live much closer to suffering than we do. And so even though there are segments of American society, like the Latino community and the Black community, they have, and the Jewish community, they have good mourning, MOURN customs, mourning customs, and they still follow them. So they have some structures for grief. As one African-American woman in one of my classes says, we know how to sing someone home when they die, you know. But there's also a huge section of our country that in the last 100 years has abandoned almost all mourning rituals. So nobody wears a black armband anymore. Nobody dresses in subdued colors. Nobody gives you 6 months to just stay home if you want to. Now you're more likely to be badgered by friends saying, you got to get out. Because everybody thinks they know what's best for you. And because we know so little about grief, we are loving friends, but we may or may not realize, no, she's been an introvert all her life. She does not need to get out. That would not be helpful right now. Now, maybe if I brought a movie over and a bowl of popcorn and sat with her, that might help, you know. So the first two movements of the book are, well, let me read you this one that we put right in the front. It's short, and it's by Gregory Orr, ORR. And Gregory Orr, he knows grief because when he was 10 or 11 years old, he was out hunting with his dad and his brother. And he accidentally shot his brother fatally in a hunting accident. And he's had to live with that all these years, you know.
Wow.
So, and of course, he suffered all the things that you suffer in a culture where people, you know, don't know what to say, where blaming happens and so on. But he's taken his grief and he's really made it into a gift for the rest of us. He doesn't only write about grief, but listen to this one called Grief Will Come to You. Grief will come to you. Grip and cling all you want. It makes no difference. Now think about that for a minute. The inevitability of grief. This is something we pretend, many of us, isn't even so. Then he goes on to say, catastrophe is just waiting to happen. Loss, you can be certain of it. Flow and swirl of the world, carried along as if by a dark current. Now notice he doesn't say, isn't this awful? Life is terrible. He's just saying, grief will come to you. Like, be ready or try to be ready. And the last two lines are, all you can do is keep swimming. All you can do is keep singing. So there's this very hopeful note at the end, like life is worth living, even though it's full of suffering. Well, you can imagine the kind of conversation that would spark if you used this book in a support group, for example. So one of the ways some people are using it is when they, like in hospitals, for example, if you have a loss, you're often invited into a grief group, and they usually use something like the grief recovery workbook or one of a few standard curriculums that try to teach people what grief is and support them. They're usually only about 6 weeks long. Some people come once, you know, some people stay and love every minute of it. But what happens a lot of times, and a couple chaplains told me this and was part of what kept me going, is that at the end of the 6 weeks, the group has bonded, they've shared, they have a lot to think about, and they'll say, well, what's next? And then they say, well, this is it. You know, that was the end of the curriculum. And so part of what I'm saying when people ask me about how to use the book is, this is a great book, not for the day after the funeral, but to give somebody 6 weeks or 2 months after the funeral, or to use as a second grief group book, Or I've had beautiful notes from people. Oh my gosh, people are so kind. Um, like use a poem like that to
Mm-hmm.
start a group. Put it up on a screen or hand it out on a piece of paper, and let people be quiet with it for a minute and then say, so what do you think? And there's something about using a poem, a good poem, the right poem. I have a whole little section in here on how to choose good poems, because they're not all created equal for this work, of course. But if you have the right poem and a facilitator that knows how to make things feel safe, it opens the group up. This is what people have written to me in far more significant level of conversation than just, hi, I'm Kim and I'm from Lakewood and I lost my mother.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the idea, that time is precious, and when people are together, they want to do the grief work. Let's help them do it.
So, if you are talking about doing the grief work and then talking about COVID and talking about businesses like home care or working with seniors in senior communities,
Yes.
or the hospitals, we're not done. We're not done.
No. Oh my
And
gosh, we're
so
hardly
how,
started.
yeah. And then so how do we get this out to
Yes.
start to help people now? Because in 6 weeks, there is no 6 weeks. We've already been doing this almost a year. We're 2 months
Yes.
shy of a year
Right.
in March.
Right.
So how do we, or how, when would you suggest, I guess, that you start to think about maybe putting together that type of group in those business situations?
Well, one of the, we're in Cleveland, Greater Cleveland, of course, and one of the we're so blessed. We have so many very fine organizations in Cleveland to address grieving, and one is Cornerstone of Hope.
Mm-hmm.
And I know at you're familiar, yeah, good people. And at Cornerstone of Hope, I know that if somebody wants to come in very soon after the death, they would usually talk to them about either, can you wait for a little while until the first numbness and shock is over,
Mm-hmm.
or would you like to do some individual counseling and then join a group? So the experts, far more expert than I, feel that the first couple weeks people are just blown away. I mean, I know when my parents died 3 weeks apart, right before my manuscript was due. So when I took this assignment, they were in excellent health, and by the time the final draft of the book was being looked at for last errors corrections, they were both gone. So, and I'm an only child, and I was the executor and all that. I have a stepbrother and he was good too, but we're both out of town. And so, you can imagine what that was like. So my kids, they were in Arizona. My kids flew out to Arizona with me, and we just go through this whirlwind of 2 hospices, and holy moly. So my daughter said to me, my adult daughter said to me, Mom, I can't get over you. You are like a machine. I said, well, I have to be right now. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't have time I can't be sitting in a corner crying. Because we didn't know my mom was going to pass. My dad had a stroke. My mom needed care. And then she had a stroke. But we were putting everything in place as if she, you know, ugh. So anyway, when I finally got home, I'm not kidding you, I spent 5 days under a quilt. I could hardly put a sentence together. And I'm sure that many people who suffer a death or other accumulated losses, you alluded, Melinda, to the loss of a job or the loss of a home, or I know some people have had to downsize their apartments because their income is reduced and the rents were too much and so on. When all those losses create a kind of numbness at the beginning and then a real need for connection and support. Mm-hmm. So I would say that any place that should look for somebody who's a trained facilitator, not just the most recent person that you hired who you can fob it off on, which I've heard those stories too.
Mm-hmm.
Because how do I say this delicately? I can't hardly think of a way to say it delicately.
You don't have to be delicate. It's okay.
A bad grief group is almost worse than no grief group. So when I interviewed people, I heard any number of people. I would always ask, did you attend a grief group after your loss? Many, many, many of them went once or twice. What made you drop out? I thought that was important. I hope somebody really does some serious research on that, you know. But what they said, so anecdotal evidence is that they didn't get any lift or skills from it. It was just shared sorrow. Now, sorrow shared is valuable. So it's not just like, but I mean, like it was only shared sorrow. So one woman, there was a grief group, 16 people in it the first night. That's too big. All the research shows it should be closer to 8, 10 at a stretch. 6 is good, you know. So 16. And then what they spent the whole 2 hours going around the circle, people telling the story of their loss. So by the end, you have heard 16 people sobbing about their loss. You know, who wants to, most people don't want to come back for a second night of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm really big on using a curriculum. It doesn't have to be my book. There are lots of good ones. I can give you some, if you can post them somewhere, I can give you some links and to ones that are good. But the person has to be a trained facilitator. They have to know something about grief work. And if the organization was allowing 16 people, this was at a hospital, already you know that they don't know a whole lot about grief work. That could have easily and should have been broken down into 2 groups of 8. So I say, yeah, the time is now. Like, this is the moment. And I've been offering low cost workshops to people that want them. It's been a privilege. Some people have a stipend for me, some don't. I mean, I'm thrilled to have a stipend, but I love helping people who want to help other people.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a chance to talk to all the spiritual care coordinators at Hospice of the Western Reserve, how to use poetry as a tool, part of your healing ministry. It's not for every client, it's not for every situation, but it's a powerful tool in your toolbox, especially when people are keeping vigil around a dying person. It can be very, very good then. And then I didn't even say this yet. It's not just poems. It's not just an anthology. When I handed in the manuscript to my editor, said, you have written a book full of poems for people who think they don't like poetry. And that was one of the biggest compliments I got, because that was exactly my goal, to make poems, the right poems, accessible to people who don't have the time or interest to, you know, search them out, and make them just one more tool in their caring toolbox. Because of the way poetry as distilled language really hits the nail on the head. So let me tell you a story. I have a friend who's a chaplain. She's been using poetry in her chaplaincy for many years. And she was working with someone who had anticipatory grief. This was a man maybe only in his 50s, and he had a terminal illness. And he had been a super hard charger, you know, like spend it all now and then enjoy your life when you retire. So he didn't have much in the way of family or even friends. And he was mad. She said he was so angry. I mean, she didn't reveal, you know, HIPAA. She didn't reveal anything, but we kind of talked together about, holy cow, how do you help this man? So she went in and talked to him. He was pretty dismissive. She went back again, not so great. And third time she went in, she took a poem in and she read it, and then she left a copy of it with him to think about. And it was a poem by a man who actually is a counselor himself. And I think it's called Anyone Can Sing. See, I didn't know I was going to tell this story, so I don't have it pulled up. But anyway, here's the power of poetry. It's a very short thing, maybe 12 lines. He cried like a baby. She said it was such a breakthrough. He finally felt heard. You know, the poem acknowledged in words he could not find himself, exactly what he was feeling. And that was the moment that they were able to start to talk. And, who knows what he thought. Sometimes when a chaplain comes in, people think you're going to try and persuade them into a faith, or, and so they're all their guard is up. But when she used this poem to say, maybe this will speak to you, or maybe you feel like this, all the fences came down. And that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it. So each poem is followed by a quote, because that way, if a group uses it and they don't like the poem, they might like the quote, and then they have something to talk about. So here's one called Prague. I put this in here. One of my friends said, make sure there's something in there for men. You're a woman writing a book about grief. Make sure there's something in there for men. And I carried that with me like a charge. So Prague, the city of Prague. The day I learned my wife was dying, I told myself, if anyone said, well, she had a good life, I'd punch him in the nose. How much life represents a good life? Maybe 100 years, which would give us nearly 40 more to visit Oslo and take the train to Vladivostok, learn German and read Thomas Mann in the original. Even more baseball games, more days at the beach, and the baking of more walnut cakes for family birthdays. How much time is enough? How much is needed for all those unspent kisses, those slow walks along cobbled streets? I mean, this man's not making this stuff up. Like, this poet, he gets it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is early in the book, and my reflection, so it's a poem, my reflection, and a quote, is reading Prague might encourage you to make an inventory of your own feelings. Include anything. It's your list, your feelings. Start where it started, with the sense that something was wrong, or a diagnosis, or whatever day one was for you. You may find yourself with thoughts of a column B, feelings engendered by comments that triggered you. Accept all of your feelings, and keep in mind the wisdom of poet David White, who said, to forgive is to put oneself in a larger gravitational field of experience than the one that seemed first to hurt us. So you see how I snuck a little bit in there about people will say hurtful things,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have to carry them on your back. And then I have, there's maybe 2 more paragraphs here. And every closing paragraph of the reflection has 2 or 3 questions. So is there any comfort for you in remembering that often people can say foolish things out of their own discomfort? The Prague poet was triggered to express anger, but the bottom line of this poem has to do with the hunger for more. There's not enough time with a loved one. A social worker, Virginia, told the story of how, on the anniversary of her dear friend Meta's death, she heard herself say, okay, I did my part. I let her go. But she's been out there with you for a year. She's talking to God as she understands God. And I've changed my mind. I want her back. The hunger for every minute taken away is achingly specific to each life. What do you want more time for? What has been stolen by this illness or loss? So you could do this alone and take those questions to meditation, or an advisor, a grief counselor, a spiritual director, or your journal, depending on your own personality. And
So
that's just the first part.
But I think that's how I got into doing my social media post and into this podcast, thanks to Karen, because I took those feelings of all the things I was going through, particularly with my cancer, though there were numerous other challenges at the same time, and I put it out there, and it was okay. It was okay to feel that way. I talked about the good. I talked about the bad. I talked about the ugly. Right. I talked about and coming through it, and that you can get through the other side, and you can get through those challenges.
Yes.
It doesn't mean it's perfect, and it's okay to feel however you feel.
Yes.
Many times I write things that are positive, right? And that's because that's, for me, that's what I need to get through it. But if it helps one other person, then I feel like, okay, I went through it and there was a benefit, if for lack of a better word.
Well, like
help somebody
Gregory,
else.
or you can take your grief and you can let it embitter you. And we know people who've done that. And we know people who've been through terrible suffering with whoever they were caring for. Not every death is beautiful, one person said to me. And I kept that in mind, all the while I was writing. And not every relationship is uncomplicated. The person who you lost might, well, I know I've died 2 dads. I had a stepdad. That's who I was talking about dying right before my mom. And then my biological dad, who I didn't meet until I was 12. And he loved me, no doubt about it, but he lived in another city. We didn't see each other very often. He had his own dragons to slay, as we all do. And so when he died, when I was 37, one of the biggest griefs was we will never now have the relationship that I hoped we might have. They'll never, the time, there's no more chances. Right. And I tried to keep that in mind. I mean, I came to terms with that. That's a big part of the grieving process for many people. But it's also okay to say that out loud, to acknowledge it. Doesn't mean I'm a bad daughter. Doesn't mean I didn't love him. It just means it is what it is. And part of grieving is living in reality.
Living in that moment of grief.
And realities are different, right? And then, like you said, so often when it rains, it pours. So you weren't just dealing with a diagnosis. You had all these other challenges too. And that's exactly what people are experiencing now, in the pandemic. When it rains, it pours. So the need for resilience skills, which is what we want to talk about the next time, is really great. And the good news is, I say this a couple places in here, no matter how much you're suffering now, and like, I know you are, it's not, I avoid words like heal. You don't have to heal from your grief. You don't have to recover from your grief. You don't have to get over your grief, but you can learn to carry your grief, just like we learn to carry all the obstacles that we have faced. And it can hollow us out, in really good ways if we let it. Now, it's no fun. Nobody wants to join this club. When somebody gets this bad diagnosis, you don't say, oh, great, now I'm going to have an opportunity to really grow psychically and spiritually as I navigate this difficult path. Right? Nobody says that. Nobody ever will. But if you're in the club, you still have choices, to be miserable 100% of the time, or to be miserable. I would say at the beginning, I was miserable 40 or 50 or 60% of the time, depending on the day. Of course, for the first 5 days, I was under the quilt. So that tells you something too, right? But we have to admit that to each other. Otherwise, people think they're crazy. What's wrong with me? I only got 3-day leave and I'm back at work and nobody's even mentioning the death. And I feel like I'm losing my mind. Well, that's normal. Somebody needs to tell people, it's normal.
It's interesting you talk about the workplace, because when my mother-in-law passed away, my husband had a weekday job. Okay. Yes. They barely gave him time off. And he had a weekend job, and he was told, said we buried her on a Friday and he had to be at work Friday night. They told him if he didn't show up, he was going to lose his job. And we counted on that money. And the two of us talked to each other, and he finally said, I can't bring her back. I respected her, at the funeral. And I was angry for him.
Yes.
Now, it worked for him because he worked through it. And, I'm the more emotional person than he is.
Yes.
But it bothered me that he couldn't have even that extra evening or day.
Oh, that's painful.
Exactly.
And that's what I mean by loyalty in an employee. How does that make an employee? I mean, I'm sure your husband is a great guy and does work hard for his employer, but many people would be like,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Because they'd be so hurt and angry, they wouldn't even do good work. It doesn't even make economic sense. That's what I mean about us being we're very grief averse and kind of ignorant as a culture about, yeah, maybe it's short-term pain for them to have to cover for him that night, but long-term gain, you know, like the next day they have a more rested worker and they have a very grateful worker. And who wouldn't prefer that? I don't understand how some people make their decisions.
I think you touched on that with our culture. I do think that's an American culture, American air quotes culture, because when you go to some other countries, and you mentioned even within our country, you know, certain some cultural groups allow for that grief time. Yes. And they understand that.
Right.
And so if you work within that culture, it's all good. But when you have to go out into the rest of the American culture,
right,
not so good. It's all about.
We're not great at any kind of self-care, really.
No,
I mean, we are getting better at it, and it's certainly something we're all learning about. But what I mean is 2 weeks vacation. You know, Europeans think we're out of our minds. They all have 6 weeks vacation right out of college.
Right.
You know, and so if you want to take a half a day off to go see the school play rehearsal, you can do it. Here you have to move heaven and earth to raise a family and work at the same time. No wonder people are so burned out.
Well, look at what we have to do to have a Family Leave Act just to be able to take care. I mean, we have to have legislation in order to force an employer to give a full-time worker, not necessarily a part-time worker, and there are more part-time workers today than ever, time off to take care of their family.
Right. And look at maternity leave. I mean, our maternity leave is like the worst in the developed world, you know? So part of my, you know, there's so much suffering, and, you know, I'm a certified spiritual director. And so, you know, people call me and ask for prayers or so on. I mean, I put up a flip chart on the back of my kitchen door because I had promised my prayers to so many people, and I didn't want to take that lightly, you know? So there's just so much suffering that it can be overwhelming. But my constant hope is that this is a huge wake-up call, that people will remember what this was like, and that there will be insistence on change. And, you know, for years, well, I still do teach a workshop called Generations in the Workplace. And some people would be like, oh, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. But, you know, that was a joy and a privilege to teach, because everybody got their voice. And in the room, there would almost always be boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, and now Gen Zs are coming into the workforce because they're out of college. And so if you make it a safe environment, and it's my job, that's what I'm getting paid to do, and a stimulating environment, they start to talk to each other. And, you know, the millennials and the Gen Xers too, to a degree, think that I'm a baby boomer, so I'm going to make fun of my own generation for a moment. They think we're nuts because, you know, we had this 40-hour work week that our forebears fought tooth and nail to get. And then because baby boomers were such a big generation and there was all this competition to rise to the top, they start going in at 7 and going home at 7, you know, unpaid time. And so now the Xers and millennials who would like more work-life balance, you know, they're kind of mad at us. What were you guys thinking? That's what I hear sometimes. I'm like, I don't know.
Well, I think it had to do with our whole, you know, trying to, like you said, trying to move ahead. I mean, it was all about getting ahead and having the opportunity, and you would move heaven and earth to make that happen. But you were doing it also, for your family.
What we didn't realize, I don't think, was that we had abandoned so many of our simple pleasures. And I think that's part of what we were figuring out again in the pandemic, that time to play a board game is precious time and shouldn't only happen maybe on New Year's Day or something, you know? And so I'm hoping that we're all learning things that will be true takeaways, because otherwise a lot of this suffering was in vain, and that breaks my heart. You know, we can bring meaning to some of the suffering that we've experienced as a country if we let it shape our future. And believe me, the millennials, they're ready to shape the future differently. So I'm going to read another poem if I may. Do we have time for that, Melinda?
Sure.
It's by Mark Nepo, which is a name that I imagine is familiar to many of your Heart Mojo people, because he's, you know, his books are all bestsellers, and he's a cancer survivor.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks he's living an examined life, you know, and he's helping the rest of us to do it too. So this poem is called Adrift, and it catches some of this ambiguity that we've been wrestling with a little bit. Because we didn't even talk about ambiguous loss, but that is definitely one of the things people are experiencing now. So if we run out of time, listeners, look up what is ambiguous loss, because it will really help you understand why you feel the way you do right now. So here's Adrift by Mark Nepo. Everything is beautiful, and I am so sad. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. The light spraying through the lace of the fern is as delicate as the fibers of memory forming their web around the knot of my throat. The breeze makes the birds move from branch to branch as this ache makes me look for those I've lost in the next room, in the next song, in the laugh of the next stranger. In the very center, under it all, what we have that no one can take away, and all that we've lost face each other. Listen to that line. At the very center, under it all, what we have that no one can take away, and all that we've lost face one another. It is there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists inside everything. I am so sad, and everything is so beautiful.
Well, that's a good
That's
one.
a poem, right?
Right. That's a good one.
I got goosebumps reading it to you.
To encompass what we've talked about, the good, the bad, right?
Yes. And learning how to hold it, the both and, the no longer, not yet.
Right.
I think that's the whole task of maturity. And, you know, becoming mature is hard.
And some people never do.
No, and some people don't want to.
Right.
And some people don't want you to become mature. And that's something we take up in the book too, that, you know, the whole family dynamic isn't going to suddenly become healthy just because somebody died. In fact, often it becomes more difficult. So we have any number of journaling opportunities and quotes in here to help sustain people on their path, even if others don't understand it. And what I'm really proud of is that people have said to me, despite the theme of the book, it's not a depressing book. It's a book full of, you know, like hope and ways to help yourself, and the knowledge that the only way out is through, which is not fun, but it's valuable. The through is worth it because of what you have on the other side.
Well, my word for this year is forward, moving forward. So that's
beautiful.
kind of the same thing is going through. Every year I read a book called One Word. I don't know if you've ever read it.
No, I
but
don't. Do you recommend
I pick one word, and you can use it for personal or business. I usually try to do the one word for both. Yes. And in the past, it's been declutter and other things, which I still am working on. But
aren't we all?
Aren't we all? Right. But forward, particularly for this year, and it held a lot of meaning for me. And so when I start to lose track of where I am, I think, okay, I'm moving forward. And so that's my word. So it just depends on what word works for you.
I love that.
Something to think about. I think
that's a good word for grievers. And because forward means steady movement, it doesn't mean running, racing, leaving behind the grief. It's a healthy image of moving with what is, you know.
And that's exactly where I'm at right now.
Moving with what is.
And I've always done that, I guess. That's how I got through with the cancer, all the things there. I just continue to move forward through it. But for whatever reason, maybe because of the pandemic, I feel like for me, this is the word for the year, more so than any other time. And maybe for a lot of people, because that's,
I think
we've
so.
got
And
to
it's a
move
perfect
forward
word because you can slog forward. You know, you can leap forward, you can skip forward, and you can slog forward. And I know, you know, I'm pretty good with, like, I know a lot about resilience and I do practice what I preach, but I'm a human being like anybody else. And I had my first hug from my daughter in almost, well, since the beginning of the pandemic. So from March until Christmas, when we quarantined like crazy for weeks so that we could be together, I hadn't had a hug. And, you know, she's my heart.
Yep.
And my son is my heart, you know? And so a lot of people are going through that right now. So I get down days too. But even on your down days, you can say, okay, this is a little pause. You know, one of the things I say to myself is today or this afternoon, I am a fallow field, you know, a fallow field at rest. Things will grow again. Because I'm one, you know, I mean, I started my own company. I'm self-employed for 25 years. You know, I have pretty good energy. And I, especially when I was younger, I worked like a dog. But I'm trying to learn how to be self-compassionate, you know?
And also, I think that's a lesson that's going to come out of the pandemic as well. Well, on that note, we're going to save some of this conversation for next time. And next time, we're going to find out how you got the title of the book. Don't say anything about that now.
You have to come back and find out.
Yeah,
there's a couple stories that I want to tell about how this book came to me, and most of them are pretty funny.
So we can start with that, and then resilience and how we want to wrap up. But I so appreciate your time.
Oh, Karen and Melinda, this was a total pleasure. The time just flew.
It did. I looked down, I'm like, oh my goodness, we're almost at an hour. So we usually try to stay. Thank you so much for
the opportunity. And I do hope I didn't rattle on too much, but if I did, forgive me, because I just love this stuff. I just love it.
I appreciate your passion, and I really, I do. And I really want to, it's important to me to help people get through their challenges. That's where this all came from to begin with. And this book and you help do that for everyone.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And I'm really looking forward to 2 weeks from now. And I hope everybody watching will also be on again.
Me too.
Thank you.
Bring a friend.
Bring a friend, right. Phone a friend.
Thank you. You good women. Thank you so much.
Thank you.